I love talking about color theory because color theory means so many different things to different fields of study. For example, in art, color theory is the study of the interaction of color, the interaction of two or more colors, and how it looks aesthetically. In science, color theory is the study of the light spectrum, and there are philosophical ways to look at color. There are psychological ways to look at color. Color means different things. Politically, for example, red and blue are very political colors. And the study of color can include that. I'm going to reference this book called On Color by David Scott Kastan. It is a short but really incredible read about the different ways that we view color. It goes through each color in the spectrum as well as black, white, and gray. The first thing that it talks about in the book is what is color? And in an artistic sense, for me, color is pigment and color is light. In a scientific realm, and this is quoting the book, chemists tend to locate it in the microphysical properties of colored objects. Physicists in the specific frequencies of electromagnetic energy that those objects reflect. Physiologists in the photoreceptors of the eye that detect this energy, and neurobiologists in the neural processing of this information by the brain. Their disagreement, or more accurately, the mismatch of their inquiry, seems to suggest that color inhabits some indistinct borderland between the objective and the subjective, the phenomenal and the psychological. And I just think it is so fascinating that people have studied color for thousands of years in so many different ways, and color is something we still don't fully understand. Color is something we experience as opposed to something that exists as a property. For example, we see that an apple is red, even though the particles and the atoms and everything that makes up this apple is not actually red. We see red because of the way that our eyes and our brain are experiencing the light. But one thing that this book brings up that I hadn't really thought of before, but is an essential part of my art, is local color, and the idea that there is a red apple, and the apple is red in the grocery store under that awful lighting. The apple is red when you take it outside and bring it into your car. The apple is red if you bring it into a house with yellow light, with pink light, with blue light. And in each of these scenarios, we are seeing a different color. We are seeing the local color of the light in the room, but we are still able to identify the apple as red. And I think that is really interesting, and that's something that I explore a lot in my color. Another aspect of color that I think is really interesting is the language of color. It is something that we experience in all aspects of our life, that we don't have the language to truly explain what we're seeing, what we're feeling, what we are experiencing, who we are, our identities. And the same goes for color. We don't have the words to describe all of the colors that we're seeing. In this book, it says, is it our eyes or our language that enables the different shades of blue? Both is, of course, the answer. Color vision must be universal. The human eye and brain work the same way for nearly all people as a property of their being human. determining that we see blue. But the color lexicon, meaning not merely the particular words, but also the specific chromatic space they are said to mark, clearly has been shaped by the particularities of culture. Since the spectrum of visible colors is a seamless continuum, where one color is thought to stop and another begin as arbitrary, the lexical discrimination of particular segments is conventional rather than natural. So the idea that where one color stops and another color starts, where yellow becomes orange and orange becomes red, is very arbitrary, and that is something that is similar to the idea of identity that I have been exploring, that there are not real boundaries between genders, between sexualities, that there's a lot of fluid space there. And I love the idea that color occupies this same realm. The other aspect of the language of color that is interesting to me is the limitations of language. In this book, it talks about the color orange and how for centuries it was just described as the color between yellow and red, yellow-red, the color betwixt yellow-red, and it wasn't until trade opened up and oranges entered the common, realm of objects and words, that there finally became a distinct word for orange. And even more arbitrary is with the color orange is that Isaac Newton, who is the one who identified the Roy G. Biv rainbow, the color spectrum, and he himself only saw red, yellow, green, blue, and purple. But as a deeply religious person, he was like, okay, well, there are 7 notes in an octave, there are 7 days in a week, those are both divinely made. The rainbow is also divinely made, and so it only makes sense that there are 7 colors in the rainbow. And so he took this arbitrary idea that there must be 7 distinct colors and added orange between yellow and red, a color that hadn't really existed in the European lexicon for, even 1,000 years. I think it's just so fascinating. Another aspect of color that this book explores is different artists' relationship with color and the way that they used and explored color in their art. Van Gogh, one of my favorite artists, talks a lot about orange in his letters with his brother. He talks about the quote poles of electricity set up by placing orange and blue next to each other, that most glorious spectrum. Testing on the canvas what he had been enthusiastically reading in the color theorists with whom he had become obsessed, increasingly convinced that, quote, the laws of colors are inexpressibly splendid, not least because they are not coincidences, end quote. I just think that is that just really spoke to me. The idea that the laws of color are inexpressibly splendid because they are not coincidences, and that color is an entirely different realm of experience than we can really explain right now. Like I said, it's so different in different areas of study. I love reading about other artists and their interactions with color, and I just love this idea of the poles of electricity made between putting orange and blue together, and that's something that I like to explore in my art, is like contrasting colors and how it can really make this like electricity between them just through the color. Another thing that Van Gogh says about color is, instead of trying to render exactly what I have before my eyes, I use color more arbitrarily to express myself more forcefully. And that's something that really resonates with me as well, that color is arbitrary. It's about, the emotion, it's about the experience. And when people ask me, like, where does my color come from? Mostly it comes from what I see, and I just exaggerate it. And it's hard to explain that I try to find the relative color, oversaturate it, and just make it better, I guess. Other artists had different relationships with color. Van Gogh was a post-impressionist, and the Impressionists obviously had a huge impact on him. And they famously painted light and color in a entirely new way that people hadn't seen before. It wasn't widely accepted at the time. Their art was not shown in salons, and this is because they were being very radical with their light and color choices. And one thing that the book talks about is that they were painting not just a view on the world. Often, like in art school, they talk about you're painting like through a window into the world. But they weren't only painting the view through the window, but they were painting the window itself and the air between the canvas and the window, and the air between the window and the subjects. And thinking about everything, all of the light and all of the color that lies in the in-between, where there are no harsh boundaries or harsh edges, no arbitrary borders, no arbitrary labels for color or for light. And I believe that's one of the main reasons why the Impressionists have always really spoken to me. I love the way that they show emotion through their art, and specifically through their use of color. Color is obviously really important to me, and it's important to these artists. But one thing I learned in this book that really changed my view on color is how important it is in a capitalist society. The indigo dye used to make army uniforms and navy uniforms, the navy blue, was in the past made by like a really intense chemical process that was made profitable by slave labor and very dangerous and awful to do. And there is a quote along the lines of, not a single chest of indigo crossed the seas without being stained with blood. And the idea that this color, this dye, to be used to signify power in this uniform was so important that people were literally dying over it. And that just really speaks to the psychological and like emotional importance of color, as well as really opens my eyes to there is no pure way to consume color as an artist who is like using pigment. Obviously, like indigo dye, blue dyes, these are they can be made synthetically now, and so it's not the same cost on like a large scale level. But I buy paper, I buy a lot of paper, I buy a lot of paint, I use a lot of water, and it's something that I think is important to think about as an artist is what is the cost of your art on an environmental level. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know what you want to hear me talk about. I'd love to talk about color, about watercolor, my process, my concepts, tarot. Just let me know what you'd like to hear.